Hi guy, welcome back. TV spoilers revealed that Michael had grown used to being watched, judged, measured down to the smallest breath he took in rooms where power decided who survived and who disappeared. But this time was different. This time, it didn't feel like ordinary professional pressure or a routine interrogation. It felt like the heavy, suffocating weight of a storm forming right in the heart of Genoa City, where the line between loyalty and betrayal was so thin that one wrong blink could send you falling into the abyss. Everything had been building for days, the secrets circling around Matt, the shadowy moves of Cane and Phyllis, and the mounting chaos from dangerous technological attacks that had pushed both Newman and Abbott into full-blown alarm mode. Even the strongest players were starting to look rushed. Even the coldest ones were behaving as if they were racing against the clock. And right at the center of that tightening web stood Michael, the man who had always been the key to Victor's darkest or suddenly becoming the weak link someone could exploit, or the pawn that could be snapped in half, depending on who reached him first. In tomorrow's episode, Michael is questioned aggressively. But the aggression isn't only in the tone or the words, it's in the way every stare seems to say that no one trusts anything anymore. Diane comes to him not merely as an old friend, but with the icy focus of someone fighting for Jack, for the survival of the Abbott family in a moment when Victor might be shifting into a mode where he destroys anything that blocks his path. Diane had asked Michael to provide anything that could help them protect Abbott, and on the surface, it sounded logical, almost like a strategic hand reaching out for assistance. But Michael could sense another layer beneath it. Diane didn't only want information. She wanted a crack. She wanted to know where Michael truly stood now that Genoa City's two greatest forces might form a shadow alliance one minute and turn on each other the next. And when someone like Victor didn't just play to compete anymore, Rio played to win at any cost. Recently, Jack had made a shocking revelation about Victor Newman. It wasn't a personal confession or a petty scandal. It felt like a stone thrown into still water, sending violent ripples outward through every relationship tied to them. That revelation was what sent Diane straight back to Michael. To her, Michael wasn't simply a source, he was a shortcut. He was close enough to Victor to see what Victor truly feared, what Victor was hiding, and what Victor was calculating before pressing the button that would ruin lives. Diane already knew Cane and Phyllis were involved. Even if Michael said nothing, she could feel that truth like a splinter under the skin. Cane and Phyllis always showed up at the worst possible time. And now they weren't just troublemakers, she were the spark that could ignite full-scale war between Newman and Abbott. While the people caught in the middle would be crushed first, Michael tried to stay silent, or at least to appear silent, because silence was often the only way to survive when any sentence could be twisted into a weapon against you. But Diane wasn't the type to back down. She didn't ask casually. She asked like she was drilling through layers, like she believed that if she pressed long enough, even stone would fracture. Michael saw something dangerous in her eyes, the light of a woman who had chosen her target and would use whatever it took to reach it. He knew Diane was acting for Jack and for Abbott, but also for herself. Diane had always wanted to prove she was no longer someone to be underestimated, that she could stand on equal ground with the most powerful people in town without bowing her head. To do that, she needed a clear victory, one large enough that no one would ever dismiss her again. And Michael could become the ladder to that victory. Even as Michael fought to hold his expression steady, he couldn't stop his thoughts from spiraling around one bitter truth. Victor Newman never stayed broken or desperate for long. Michael had watched Victor get hit, betrayed, cornered. And still he had never seen Victor truly collapse. Because Victor didn't process fear like normal people. He converted it into fuel. He didn't complain. He retaliated. And when Victor felt threatened, he didn't defend himself, attacked first. What Diane wanted from Michael wasn't just surface-level information. She wanted something that lived in Victor's deepest planning. The kind of secrets Victor only shared with those he trusted completely, the hidden connections, the next moves, the real targets. Diane wanted to understand what Victor was preparing to do to Jack, to Abbott, and to anyone Victor believed was destabilizing the entire board, people like Cane and Phyllis. Diane believed that if she understood Victor, she could protect Jack. But Michael could see the darker truth. Diane wasn't just trying to protect Jack. She was trying to control Victor by holding a piece of his soul in her hand. Michael's real trap began when Diane shifted tactics. She realized she didn't need Michael to speak if she could find proof on her own. She approached Michael's office with the confidence of someone who believed every door could be opened if you searched for the right weak point. whether it was accidental or whether she had disguised intention beneath the mask of coincidence. Diane found her opening inside the documents tied to Victor. She didn't need to read everything. Diane only needed something small, a wrong pattern, an unfamiliar line, a detail that didn't belong. And then she saw it, encrypted emails, or notes hinting at a mysterious meeting between Michael and Jack. That moment was like a quiet click inside Diane's mind, as if a lock had finally turned. She didn't know the full story, but she didn't need the full story. She only needed enough to build suspicion. And suspicion in Genoa City could kill someone long before truth ever arrived. Diane realized Michael might be considering betrayal, or at least standing in a dangerous gray zone, where one wrong move would leave him crushed between two empires. The vague tone of what she found became pure fuel for her instincts and her survival intelligence. It didn't say outright that Michael had betrayed Victor, but it created a feeling that Michael might not be absolutely loyal anymore. And in this world, the feeling alone was lethal. Diane didn't make noise. She didn't rush out screaming that she had discovered something explosive. She stayed silent, but her silence had the sharpness of someone holding a knife. She quietly photographed the evidence, copied what she could, and preserved every trace with frightening precision. She didn't use it immediately because Diane understood timing. A weapon only has power when you strike at the perfect moment, when your target is weakest, most afraid, and most desperate. And that moment arrived faster than she expected, because Michael had already been living with his nerves stretched tight as wire. When Diane scheduled a private meeting with Michael, the atmosphere didn't need shouting. It was thick enough without it, heavy like smoke trapped in a closed room. Diane laid out the evidence the way someone drops the final card on the table, leaving the other player nowhere to hide. Michael felt as if the air had been ripped from his lungs. He hadn't expected Diane to go that far, hadn't expected her to find the trail so quickly, so ruthlessly. In one brutal second, his future collapsed inside his mind, his career, his reputation. Everything he had built with caution and loyalty. If Victor learned Michael had any shadow connection to Jack, Victor wouldn't ask why. Victor would punish. Not to teach a lesson, but to make an example. Michael panicked, but not in a loud, explosive way. It was the kind of panic that turns inward, compressing into the chest like a stone pressing down on the heart. He understood Diane was holding something that could destroy him. And Diane understood that he understood. The balance of power flipped instantly. For years, Michael had been the man holding other people's weaknesses. Now he had become the one being held. The humiliation stung, but fear was stronger. Because Michael's worst fear wasn't losing a job. It was being branded a traitor by Victor Newman. And once Victor marked you a traitor, forgiveness did not exist. Diane didn't have to say much. Her eyes delivered the message: cooperate, or be dragged into the light where Victor would crush him like dust. Diane demanded deeper secrets about Victor, information beneath the surface. The things Victor never let the world see. Diane wanted Victor's private strategies, his next steps. The real reason behind the war he was preparing. She wanted to know what Victor planned to do to Jack, to Abbott, and how Victor intended to deal with Cane and Phyllis. Diane believed she was saving Jack. But Michael knew the truth. She was asking him to cut into Victor's core. Michael became trapped inside a violent war with his own conscience. On one side was his loyalty to Victor, the man who had elevated him, trusted him, placed him close to the heart of power. Michael wasn't Victor's friend in any warm, emotional sense, but he felt bound by obligation. Betraying Victor wasn't just dangerous, it felt morally wrong in a way that chilled him. Victor demanded loyalty as payment for power, and Michael had accepted that bargain long ago. But on the other side was survival. Diane held proof. If she exposed it, Victor would know. If Victor knew, Michael would lose everything. And worse, he might become a target, not only professionally, but personally. Genoa City didn't require bullets to kill you. It only required cutting away your reputation, your income. Your supper until you had nothing left to stand on. Diane spoke of Cane and Phyllis like they were disease. She emphasized they were the source of the chaos. That they had pushed Victor into dangerous territory. That they were triggering Victor's worst instincts. Diane wanted Michael to see that she wasn't merely blackmailing him. She was offering him an escape route by forcing him into the Abbott side. But Michael could see the other truth. Once you crossed that line, there was no return. Victor never forgave defectors. Victor could survive failure, but he could not tolerate betrayal. And in the current climate, where Victor might even be capable of an unexpected alliance with Jack to neutralize threats like Cane, betrayal became even more deadly. An alliance like that wouldn't create peace, it would create a more refined war, where the weakest people in the middle would be sacrificed first. Michael knew that better than anyone. He knew because he had spent years clearing the path for Victor in wars exactly like this. Michael's mind began to fracture under the weight of imagination. He pictured Victor hearing the news, Victor's eyes going dark, his voice turning to ice. Michael had seen it before. Victor didn't shout. He simply grew quiet, and then he struck fist, clean, final. Michael pictured Jack too, a man who seemed more moral than Victor, but who could still become ruthless in his own way when his family was threatened. Jack might not destroy you instantly, but he could erase you from the game permanently. In this war, Michael no longer trusted that anyone would save him. He could only save himself. Every moment of silence grew sharper. Michael told himself Diane's evidence was vague, not enough to convict him. But he also knew Genoa City didn't require certainty to destroy you. All it needed was a story, a rumor planted in the right ear. Diane could use that suspicion like a knife even before Victor ever saw it. And the most terrifying possibility was this: Diane could leak it to someone in the Newman family. And suspicion would become truth long before Michael even made a choice. He understood how rumors worked here. They didn't just damage reputations, they dismantled protection, leaving you isolated. And when you were isolated, you became easy to kill. Diane kept pressing. She wanted Victor's deepest secrets, and if Michael refused, she would let Newman know what she'd found. Diane didn't need to phrase it with obvious threats. Michael's own mind painted the consequences more brutally than any words. He felt trapped between two invisible hands, Diane holding evidence, Victor holding vengeance in the shadows. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He could only think, and the more he thought, the more he understood Diane wasn't playing a small game. This was a war for control of the truth itself. If Diane forced Michael to talk, Abbott gained the upper hand. If Victor sensed Michael wavering, Victor would strike first. And in both versions of the future, Michael could lose everything. Michael left the meeting feeling like someone who had survived a crash but hadn't felt the pain yet. He knew Diane wouldn't stop. He knew the pressure would only tighten. And he knew that if he didn't decide soon, someone else would decide for him. Victor. Michael tried to tell himself there was time. But Genoa City never gave anyone much time. Especially not when Victor was already being provoked by Cane and Phyllis. And Jack was being forced into desperate survival mode for the Abbott family. And then, right before the moment ended, one small detail appeared like a cold cut across the skin. Diane might not have been the first person to see those files. The traces she found could have been noticed already. And if the person who noticed was Victor, someone Victor used as an extension of his will, then Michael was no longer standing between loyalty and betrayal. He was standing inside a purge that had already begun, with him as the first target. The next episode wouldn't just be about Diane forcing Michael to reveal secrets. It would be about whether Michael had enough time left to hide the truth, or whether Victor had already ordered the chair to be kicked out from under him, silently, invisibly, long before Michael even realized the trap had closed. And as Michael stepped back into his office, the door shut behind him with a sharp, final click, like someone had just locked him inside the very cage he never saw coming. Michael Baldwin understood a truth that very few people in Genoa City ever dared to say out loud. In a war between the Newmans and the Abbotts, information could be more lethal than a gun. It could save an empire, but it could also destroy a life with nothing more than a carefully placed whisper. And in these chaotic days, when the shockwaves surrounding Matt had the entire city stretched to the breaking point, when Cane and Phyllis had become the kind of names that could freeze Victor Newman's expression, when Jack Abbott no longer believed that morality alone could protect his family, Michel felt the rhythm of the war changing. He didn't need to be warned. He saw it more clearly than anyone because he stood too close to the center of Newman power, too close to Victor himself to misunderstand how survival really worked. In Victor's world, the one who lasted wasn't always the strongest. It was the one who struck at the right moment with the right precision and left no room for retaliation. Diane Jenkins appeared in front of him in that exact moment. And Michael didn't need her to explain herself. He could read her motive in the way she watched him, in the careful pressure behind every question. Diane was trying to extract internal information. She was trying to slip into the deepest levels of Newman's strategy through a softer, more elegant route. On the surface, she could frame it as protecting Abbott, protecting Jack, protecting the Abbott family from being swallowed whole by Victor Newman's next move. But Michael was not unfamiliar with the energy in Diane's iced kind of ambition that wore a mask of righteousness, the hunger for control that only someone who had once been cornered could carry so naturally. Diane didn't just want to know what Victor was planning. She wanted to move ahead of him. She wanted leverage. She wanted to hold a piece of the balance of power in her own hands, so she would never be underestimated again. And she chose Michael because she believed he was a crack in the wall. She believed he could be shaken. She believed that a man who had spent his life serving monsters like Victor would eventually want a way out. But Diane misjudged something crucial. Michael was no longer the kind of man who could be guided by persuasion alone. His loyalty to Victor wasn't simply about protection or career benefit. It was rooted in his understanding of what betrayal cost. Victor didn't need perfect evidence to condemn someone. All he needed was the scent of doubt, the smallest hint that someone had stepped out of alignment. And once Victor placed a name on the list of people who needed to be removed, everything else became procedure. Michael knew that truth like he knew his own heartbeat. So when Diane pressed him for information, Michael didn't react with trembling panic. His fear was sharper and more control-led, the fear of a man who understood that this was a defining moment. Either he became the one being hunted or he turned the hunter into prey. Michael listened as Diane circled the subject, watching how she shifted angles, how she paused at certain points to study his reactions. Diane didn't attack directly. She didn't demand. She didn't threaten openly. She used a far more dangerous method. She made people want to talk. She made them believe speaking was the safe choice, the reasonable choice, the right choice. Diane chose her role perfectly, a woman trying to protect her family, trying to shield Jack and Abbott from Victor's crushing force. She summoned a sense of urgency, the feeling that time was running out, that if the Abbotts hesitated even once, they would lose everything. And Diane believed Michael, despite being Victor's lawyer, could still be reached through something called a conscience. But Michael wasn't being driven by conscience anymore. He had gone too far to return to innocence. He had witnessed too many shadow negotiations, too many deals signed without witnesses, too many realities twisted into truth by the sheer will of whoever held power. And because of that, the more Diane pushed, the more terrifyingly calm Michael became. His calm was not the calm of someone who had nothing to hide. It was the calm of a man making a decision that would decide whether he lived or fell. The plan to trap Diane didn't arrive as a reckless impulse. It arrived as instinct, sharpened by years of survival. Michael understood he couldn't simply refuse Diane, because Diane didn't retreat once she decided to move. If she left empty-handed today, she would return tomorrow with a different strategy. She would approach someone else, dig deeper, turn minor details into larger stories, until she found something that truly harmed Newman. Michael couldn't let the Abbotts gain the truth, but he also couldn't send Diane away with nothing, because an angry Diane was more dangerous than a satisfied one. An unsatisfied Diane could become reckless. And recklessness created unpredictabilities even Victor Newman disliked. So Michael chose the cruel solution, the effective one: give Diane what she wanted. But give her lies. Not foolish lies, not obvious fabrications, but secrets crafted so convincingly that she would run straight back to the Abbotts, believing she carried a bomb only for that bomb to explode in their hands. Michael began constructing those secrets with the precision of a man who understood his enemy's psychology. The information had to sound real enough for Diane to believe it. It had to sound valuable enough for Jack to act on it. It had to feel urgent enough for the Abbotts to move quickly. But it also had to be warped at the exact right places so it would lead them down the wrong road. This was the most dangerous part, because deception in Genoa City wasn't about saying something impossible. The best lies were half-truths, fragments of reality disguised just enough to let people complete the rest themselves, using their own fear as glue. Michael knew Diane feared Victor. He knew Jack feared losing Abbott. He knew the Abbotts feared Victor was already 10 steps ahead. Michael didn't need to invent an entirely new story. He only needed to hand Diane the wrong piece of the puzzle, and she would slot it into the Abbott picture in exactly the way that helped Newman most. When Michael leaked his twisted information, he did it with careful intention. He didn't behave like a traitor. He didn't give Diane anything so directly that it looked like betrayal. Instead, he shaped the moment to appear accidental, like something slipping out through stress, like a truth exposed under pressure, like a secret he fought to keep hidden until Diane finally tore it loose. Michael chose the exact tone, the exact pacing, the exact amount of hesitation to make Diane believe she was winning. He even allowed himself a controlled edge of discomfort, as if the truth he revealed terrified him. That reluctance became the final seal of credibility in Diane's eyes. Because Diane understood something fundamental: people are only reluctant when the information is truly dangerous. If Michael had been too easy, she would have doubted him. If he had been too rigid, she would have left empty-handed. Michael gave her the illusion of victory, and Diane accepted it greedily. Diane returned to the Abbotts with those secrets as if she carried the key to unlock hell itself. To her, this wasn't just information. It was leverage. It was the chance to let Jack stand tall in front of Victor. The chance to keep Abbott from being swallowed whole. Diane delivered what she had learned with urgency and certainty, believing she was arming her family. And the Abbott response was exactly what Michael had predicted. They couldn't sit still. They had been cornered, pressured, threatened for too long. Victor's steps always seemed calculated, brutal, unstoppable. So when Diane came home claiming she had found the crack in Newman armor, the Abbotts acted. They launched moves against Newman based on those false details. They committed resources, shifted focus, and placed their confidence in a direction Michael had already mapped out for them. It wasn't a small mistake that could be corrected quickly. It was the kind of mistake that wasted time, drained strength, and damaged unity. And the cruelest part was this: the Abbotts didn't realize they were being led like a crowd chasing a phantom. They believed they were striking Newman's weakness, but in reality they were exposing their own. Every wrong move made them more readable. Every step they took in the wrong direction showed Victor exactly what they feared, what they wanted, and where they were most vulnerable. Michael wasn't merely deceiving them, he was forcing them to reveal their strategy, without even realizing it. Meanwhile, Michael's position with Victor became stronger than ever. He didn't just avoid suspicion. He became more valuable. Because as the Abbotts misfired, as their attacks failed to land, as their moves looked desperate and ineffective, Victor saw a simple truth: the enemy was losing control. The enemy was being manipulated. And who remained solid, silent, unwavering at Victor's side? Michael Baldwin. Victor's trust tightened around him like iron, stamping Michael's career with approval, securing his position inside Newman power, and most dangerously of all, placing him deeper inside Victor's circle of protection. But Genoa City never allowed a perfect plan to exist without consequences. Because once Diane and the Abbotts acted on false information, failure wouldn't arrive only in results. It would arrive as a feeling in imbalance, a detail that didn't match, a pattern that didn't fit. Diane wasn't foolish. She could be consumed by hunger for victory, but she was still Diane Jenkins, a woman who had survived too much to ignore the smell of poison. She began to sense something wrong, and that sense grew from discomfort into suspicion. Diane's suspicion didn't explode immediately. It smoldered quietly, like embers buried beneath ash. But the more she reviewed details, the more she compared outcomes to expectations. The more she replayed Michael's words in her mind, the more she realized those secrets had been almost too perfect. They had been exactly what the Abbotts wanted to hear. That was terrifying, because real truth was usually messy and sharp-edged. Only false truth arrived neatly packaged for satisfaction. Diane began to remember Michael's eyes, his carefully placed hesitation, his controlled reluctance. And then Diane asked herself the question that changed everything: was it all performance? As Diane started to suspect betrayal, cracks began forming inside the Abbott family itself. Because failure could be forgiven. But failure because you were fooled, that poisoned trust. Questions started slicing into the air like knives. Who chose this direction? Who trusted Diane's information? Who gambled the future of Abbott on those claims? Diane, who had walked in as a savior holding leverage, suddenly risked becoming the one blamed for leading them into disaster. She could feel eyes shifting, loyalty cooling, confidence weakening. Diane's pride was wounded, and a wounded Diane was more dangerous than ever. She would not accept being used like a puppet. Michael, watching from the other side, kept the calm face of a man untouched by the fallout. He didn't need to celebrate. He didn't need to smile. Seeing the Abbott stumble was enough. But that victory didn't bring him peace. Instead, it carved a deeper weight into his chest, the awareness that he had stepped further into darkness, with no path back. He had chosen Victor. He had chosen Newman. He had chosen power and survival over anything else. And even if it was strategically correct, it still left a cut in his conscience. He had shattered someone else's trust to protect his position. He had made Diane look foolish in front of the Abbotts. He had dragged this war into an even dirtier, more poisonous place. Michael refused to let himself drown in guilt, because guilt was a luxury in Victor Newman's world. Weakness meant death. Hesitation meant replacement. Michael had learned long ago that nobody could afford softness at Victor's side. The price wasn't only job loss. The price was erasure. So Michael forced himself back into cold control. Diane had chosen to come first. Diane had chosen to dig. Diane had chosen to fight. If Diane lost, then Diane had simply paid the cost of stepping into Newman territory unprepared. But the thing that truly unsettled Michael wasn't Diane realizing she'd been fooled. It was what Diane would do next once she accepted it fully. Diane wasn't the type to lose quietly. When Diane was cornered, she fought harder. When Diane was humiliated, she demanded revenge. And a Diane driven by revenge could create consequences Michael hadn't planned for, even if his calculations had been flawless. Diane might not have Victor's blunt brutality, but she had something just as dangerous: stubborn persistence, survival intelligence, and the ability to turn pain into fuel. If Diane stopped trusting Michael entirely, then this war would shift into a darker arena, only fueled not only by corporate strategy, but by personal retaliation. The fractures between Diane and the Abbotts grew clearer, and those fractures became a gift to Newman. Newman didn't simply want to defeat the Abbotts. Newman wanted the Abbotts to destroy themselves from within. Michael understood that, and he knew his trap had achieved exactly the effect Victor enjoyed most, the enemy doubting each other, questioning each other, tearing at their own unity. While Newman held the calm appearance of control, Victor would believe the Abbotts were desperate. Victor would believe they were scattered. And when Victor believed the enemy was desperate, he struck to finish the job. Victor didn't enjoy dragging things out. Victor enjoyed endings. He enjoyed the final blow, the moment an opponent collapsed in full view of the city, leaving no doubt who ruled Genoa City. Michael knew he had pushed Victor closer to that moment. He had protected his position. He had forced the Abbotts off course. But he had also pulled himself into greater danger. Because once you proved your usefulness to Victor Newman, Victor depended on you more. And once Victor depended on you, the responsibility became deadly. If Victor ever failed, Victor would need someone to blame. And in Victor's world, the closest person always got hit first. Diane, on her side, continued to piece together what had happened. She replayed every detail and began to understand that Michael had offered her exactly what the Abbotts feared, exactly what they wanted, exactly what would drive them into action. Diane saw the trap clearly now, and that clarity sent cold fear through her body. If Michael was skilled enough to manipulate her that completely, then Michael wasn't simply Victor's loyal lawyer. Michael was Victor's weapon. And Diane knew that if she wanted to survive this war, she couldn't treat Michael as a passive man who followed orders. She had to treat him as the blade itself. The Abbotts and Diane might try to keep their internal fractures hidden, but suspicion could never stay silent for long. It changed how people looked at each other, how they trusted each other, how they moved. And while they were caught in that spiral, Michael felt something strange twisting in his chest, sense that he had created something larger than he intended. One perfectly timed lie could win a battle, but it could also create an enemy who would never stop hunting you. Michael began to wonder if Diane would settle for understanding she'd been fooled, or if she would drag him down with her. Would she accept humiliation in front of the Abbotts? Or would she find another way to reclaim power? Michael didn't have the answer. He only knew the tension would keep escalating, and that escalation made the air around him feel heavier with every hour. He kept his posture steady, his voice controlled, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew he was walking on thin ice. One day, the ice would crack. And when it cracked, the one who fell might not only be Diane or the Abbotts. It might be Michael Baldwin himself. The end of this storm would not be Diane realizing she'd been lied to. That was only the beginning. Because the moment Diane fully accepted Michael had trapped her, she would stop asking why and start asking how to strike back. And in Genoa City, that question always led to actions no one could predict, counterattacks no one could block in time. Michael may have won the first round with his precision and deception, but he had also placed a spark right next to the gasoline of this war. Diane stayed quiet, the Abbott stayed quiet. Newman stayed quiet, but it was no longer peaceful silence. It was held breath before the next blow landed. And just when Michael convinced himself everything was going exactly as planned, a sudden wave of unease swept through him like ice. Because if Diane had realized she'd been fooled, the greatest danger wasn't that she would confront him directly. The greatest danger was something worse. Diane might decide to prove to Victor Newman that Michael had played his game too boldly and planted a seed of doubt inside Victor's mind. Michael froze at the thought, because he knew Victor needed only the smallest spark of suspicion to turn his ruthless attention toward his own right hand. And that was the true hook hanging above Michael's head now. Sharp and merciless. If Diane knew the truth, had Victor already known first? And had Victor been testing Michael all along in a deeper, crueler way so that Michael would discover too late who the real trapped man was in this game?